All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 1st, 1934, at the White House, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt is in the midst of plotting out a number of summer camps aimed at helping women around the country learn skills and contribute to the economic recovery. Here's the context. As you know, FDR's New Deal program supported nationwide programs of resident camps for the unemployed. The most well-known were what were called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. These were mostly attended by men who learned skills and labor and were put to work on infrastructure and other programs. But there was a parallel program of camps for women, and the press somewhat mockingly referred to these as the she program. You had the CCC and the she, which, to my mind, that's actually a pretty cool name.
I'm into it.
The intent was mocking, but that's pretty badass. So the she camps are what we're going to talk about today. Super fascinating for a bunch of reasons, but also how Eleanor Roosevelt was such a champion of these efforts. So to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We just fairly recently, Kellie, talked about Eleanor Roosevelt, and she took a photo in a cockpit with a black pilot, and we talked about how, by the way, we got a letter from someone who pointed out that that's a closed cockpit plane, and that's why our jokes about Eleanor Roosevelt's hair. So
Good
yes,
to know.
We had made some jokes about why her hair didn't get messed up. Well, it turns out closed cockpit.
Now
plane.
we know.
Now we know. Thank you, listeners. But sort of one of the things we talked about there was Eleanor Roosevelt was a real champion of causes she believed in, particularly behind the scenes. She understood she had some political clout. This obviously is a story of that, and especially this moment in sort of getting ready for the summer seems to be a particular example of that.
Yeah, Eleanor does what she wants. And I think that's what people love so much about Eleanor, is that she really doesn't ask for permission. She sees a need and she tries to meet it. And she really tries to meet it with marginalized people. And women were sort of the forgotten group of the Great Depression. I think oftentimes economically, when we think of labor, men were thought of as the primary breadwinners. And so people did not think women really needed to have any sort of organization or something that would meet their needs as well. And they certainly didn't want to create jobs that they thought would be jobs that men could have instead. So prioritizing this and really letting the country know that no, women need to be busy as well. Women need to be productive. There are things that they can do, and that we need to put all of our force behind this, I think was really important. And it's sort of one of the reasons why Eleanor Roosevelt is heralded as this, feminist, progressive thinking person, because she prioritized the needs of women and girls.
Yeah, and she's working, as Kellie was pointing out, this is a real uphill battle for Eleanor Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt would often talk during the Depression about the forgotten man. And that sounds like just sort of like a placeholder term, but he really was focused on these men who were out of work. Work was seen as something that was not only central to men's identity, but that's how the economy worked. Men brought home the money and women took care of the households. And that kind of very stark division of labor, even though it wasn't true to many millions of women's experience. It was the way that people conceived of family and work. It's how they conceived of these federal programs. And even when she's able to put the forgotten people at the forefront of some of these programs, she still has to work within those constraints. And so these camps, they're not like the paid labor camps of the Civilian Conservation Corps. They're like these 4-week camps where women learn to sew or improve their sewing skills, or they learn languages, or they read literature. It's not the kind of paid labor work that you think of when you think of these programs for the New Deal.
The camps were just that, like camps. The way that we think of camps in contemporary, context, where it's like maybe you go hiking, maybe you like sew something for your mom to bring home at the end of the summer. Like it was more along that vein than it was something that was going to create workers that were going to go out into the workforce and make money.
I mean, I like that, there was hiking and swimming and so forth. Some of these were like in Bear Mountain. If people in the New York area know that, I would like to go to camp near Bear Mountain. But, there were also things like typing and filing, and there was just education, like liberal arts, like English and current events and so forth. But yeah, I mean, do you have more thoughts on kind of that those operating within those constraints of what women's work is? Does that strike you as a concession, or what do you make of that?
It is working within the realm of the pragmatic. There was a real... It wasn't just that there was this sense that women should only work in certain roles, but the idea that women would compete with men for a job was seen... It made people angry. So you couldn't train women for the jobs that men were competing for. So they had to be trained for sex-specific jobs. That's why the typing is a big part of that, because women were considered fit for secretarial labor. They were seen fit for things like sewing and working on garments and things like that. But, it wouldn't have worked. They wouldn't have gotten support if they were training women to work in factories. It would have been a program that was derided and seen as counterproductive and as taking jobs away from men. And so this is what they could do within the constraints of the time.
Yeah.
And we can say that during the Depression, like this in a lot of ways was the escape that people needed to be able to have a moment where they could be busy, where they could be productive, where they could learn a skill, and where they would not necessarily be constantly plagued by sort of the dismal outlook that the Depression gave people. And so the women who went there enjoyed it. For them, it was a fulfilling experience.
Yeah, it's so important to keep that just sort of human dimension in here as well. And no surprise, Frances Perkins, who we've talked about on this show before, Labor Secretary, sort of architect of the New Deal in many ways, was a big champion of these camps as well. To come back to this specific moment we're marking in early 34, these camps were launched in 33 and enrollment was really low. And there's a story about Eleanor Roosevelt showing up at one where she expected to see hundreds of women, and there were only like 17 or 20 people there. And so this moment in the off season between these camps is when she then just buckles down and says, okay, we're gonna really make this happen. And she convenes a sort of summit at the White House. Perkins is there, and then they really kind of push the recruitment in order to get word out and in order to sort of really get women into these camps. And it does tend to work. I mean, all told, there are about 90 camps or so, 8,000 women or so go through these. They are segregated, no surprise, but there are camps for black women as well. And so it really does seem, getting a reminder that just if there's an internal champion for something, that's often what it takes. It often can things get done.
It also does not hurt that the New York Times basically made the front page cover story these camps. So the first thing people are seeing is, hey, there's an opportunity for you, or there's an opportunity for your daughters. Yeah. And that also creates this groundswell where women show up.
And I think that you're right, Jody. It's important to have that persistent advocate. And I think it also speaks to the importance of representation. Frances Perkins was a woman. Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman. That you had these women who were also connected to a much broader network of women who were involved in things like social work and taking care of the needs of poor women and providing opportunities. You know, the camp that you were talking about in Bear Mountain, it was originally called Camp Terra, which stood for the Temporary Emergency Relief Assistance, but it's renamed Camp Jane Addams after the organizer of the settlement houses. And that, I think, reflects this shared origin story for many of these women, that their activism grew out of the settlement movement in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and then it's transformed once they have access to the federal government in a way that they simply didn't in that settlement house era.
Yeah, and the response, I think, is overwhelming. A lot of young girls and women basically said that this camp was as important to them as school was, and that everyone should have an opportunity to attend these camps. And I know it's years ago, but I went hiking in Bear Mountain. It's beautiful, you know, to be able to like have that space outside of the city, so close to the city, but still it feels like you're in a different space. It does something to transform the way that you think about your outlook and what you think might be possible for you.
We should also say at that Camp Terra, there was one of the women who went there was Polly Murray, who was the lawyer and civil rights activist and would become a correspondent of Eleanor Roosevelt. So there's this group of just like incredibly powerful and productive women who are making connections during this period.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the legacy here is interesting. Certainly a whole generation of women, I think, were galvanized by this. But also in terms of shifting the kind of status quo and shifting the idea of what women's work is. I mean, you know, earlier when we were talking about butting up against those ideas, everyone knows the story of kind of it's not until World War II and men are no longer in factories or, you know, on baseball fields or elsewhere, you know, that women kind of step into those roles, and that shifts our understanding of what women's work is. But this, I think, you know, planted the seeds for that in many ways.
Yeah, shifts it, but not permanently. I think it's also important that, like, there's this, obviously in periods of high unemployment, women have fewer opportunities. In very, very low unemployment, they have more. But, like, my grandma had to quit her job at a baby formula manufacturer when she got married because married women weren't allowed to work there. And I think that idea of who deserves to be able to work, especially when jobs are scarce, is something that is going to persist. But it's so interesting to see it change so quickly between the 1930s and the 1940s.
I also think that, you know, historical context matters here because during the New Deal, you really got this two-tiered system for men and women. You know, men are getting unemployment, men are getting pensions, men are getting really the boost that they need to be successful. Women are getting welfare. You know, women are getting dependency or systems of dependency that don't really allow them to have the independence that men get. And so, yes, these camps are important, but it's also confined within a larger system of promoting men over women.
All right. Well, I think we can leave it there with the she camps. And I just want to give a quick shout out, by the way, to a historian who wrote about this a lot, but a woman by the name of Joyce Kornblue, whose son is a family friend of ours, and I've interviewed Joyce for projects that I've done before. She's a great labor historian, and I'll leave the last word with her, but she wrote, you know, these were small but significant experiments in establishing a principle that government has a responsibility in meeting women's education and job-related needs. So, fascinating piece of history, and we leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.